All right, let's talk about Chapter 5. Really, we're talking about the things that led the United States towards their independence from Great Britain. I'm going to go through it really quickly, read about the stuff. This is basically an overview, and I just want to tell you about some of those things. So here we are. Let's get on the road and see how we got there. So here we are. Life before 1763. Basically, the colonists were left alone by Great Britain. They could make their own laws and do those kinds of things. There's a lot of different factors on why people were moving to the colonies. Now remember, a colony is basically these settlements set up by Great Britain in order to stake a claim to the land, use the resources on the land, and then make things from those resources to sell back to the people that were living in the colony. So they're basically kind of starting another country. Couple things that started taking place. There were some territorial disputes in North America between Great Britain and France. This leads to the French and Indian War. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on. And ultimately, Great Britain wins and gains control of the majority of Canada and the areas in North America. Some of the early things that took place after the French and Indian War, something called the Proclamation of 1763 was set forth by King George. He basically said American settlers cannot move west of the Appalachian Mountains. This is where we see this idea of tyranny come up. This is an idea that when somebody uses their power unjustly, and I think we can come up with examples of people in our lives that might use their power unjustly. We see another thing called the Stamp Act. This is a tax on all paper products. So think of things made with paper. Imagine having to pay extra for a stamp to put on that paper. So this is where we see the chant come out of the colonists: no taxation without representation. Because of the pushback, Great Britain ultimately repeals or ends this law. Another one was the Quartering Act. This is when Great Britain ultimately forced the colonists to house British soldiers that were there to protect the colonists from attacks from people like Native Americans and things like that. So imagine just having to have a soldier, somebody maybe you didn't like, staying at your house using your stuff. Okay, there you have the Quartering Act. Let's move on to some other stuff. We have the Townsend Acts. This is another law that was passed by the British Parliament or their government. This is a law on anything that Great Britain was sending and selling in the colonies. Okay, colonists said this is ridiculous. We need these things: glass, paint, other stuff that Great Britain makes. Basically, Samuel Adams decides to boycott this, and he sets up this boycott colony-wide, where they stopped buying British goods. This guy named Lord North becomes the newest leader in the British government, and basically he takes away all of the Townsend Act taxes on British goods, except for one on tea. And we'll talk about that here in just a moment. We've got the Boston Massacre, an incident between some angry people living in Boston and British troops that were stationed there. Ultimately, this turns into a riot. Four Bostonians, people that lived in Boston, were killed. But what we see is, well, what really happened? Paul Revere saw this as an opportunity to whip up some anti-British sentiment, which basically means to get everybody against Great Britain. But there's some other perspectives, and we got to try to figure out what really happened at the Boston Massacre. One of the things in the end was our second president, John Adams, a well-known patriot, founding father. He actually was the lawyer and defended the British soldiers. So we got to ask ourselves, why would a patriot defend these British soldiers? Some questions to continue to ask. Then we've got what's known as the Boston Tea Party. Maybe you've heard of this. This gets back to the tax that was left on tea, and what was called the tea tax. Great Britain basically had put this tax on tea. It made the tea very cheap, which ultimately forced the colonists to buy it. They're like, this is the cheapest tea, even though it's not my favorite, it's the cheapest. And this creates what we call a monopoly, which reduces the amount of choice that colonists had on buying tea. So just imagine, all of a sudden you've got one kind of soda to drink, or lemonade, or you could only drink water. That's what this was. They basically reduced the amount of choice with this monopoly on tea. So the Boston Tea Party ultimately was a reaction to that. This group of patriots called the Sons of Liberty, they boarded this ship filled with all this British tea and basically threw it into Boston Harbor. And this was to express disapproval for the Tea Act, becomes known as the Boston Tea Party. The Intolerable Acts, this is the reaction of the British government to the Boston Tea Party. So of course we see you do something, I'm going to react to that, and this is what we have. In 1774, the laws closed Boston Harbor to trade. So basically they said, yeah, you guys aren't going to be able to make any money, so we're closing the harbor. They placed Massachusetts, particularly the government, firmly under British control, which simply meant that Great Britain was controlling Massachusetts. And the third thing that the Intolerable Acts called for was basically it allowed British soldiers who were accused of murder, like those in the Boston Massacre, to be tried in Great Britain instead of the colonies. So people saw that as, oh, these guys now can get away with murder. So some interesting things with the Intolerable Acts. Great Britain really had hoped to show the colonists, particularly in Massachusetts, that they meant business. But ultimately, it had the opposite effect. What it does is it unites all the colonies, all the way down from Georgia up to Massachusetts, and says, maybe we should all band together so they don't come and do the same thing in our colony. So we see now this uniting of the American colonies. With this, the First Continental Congress is formed. This is a group of delegates or representatives from each of the colonies, and they were like, what are we going to do about this? This is getting crazy. These intolerable acts against Massachusetts, we got to come together as one and express our distaste to the British government. They decided they wanted to send a message with complaints to King George. They said, this is what's wrong. This is why we're upset. They continued their boycott of British goods, and they really focused on that boycott, making sure everybody was following it. And then they start to form what we call militias. And these are basically armies within towns and cities and colonies all across the American colonies. So they started to take up arms if necessary. So we see these things happening because of all the stuff that we've talked about. Then we see fighting happen. King George basically refuses to see the complaints. The British Army is ordered to go take control of these weapons in a town called Concord. And basically it's like an armory. It's where they store all the weapons in this particular town. Why they chose that town, not sure. But nonetheless, they're headed to Concord to take the colonists' guns. Basically, the colonists had their own spies. They were tipped off. And this is where we hear the famous saying, the British are coming by people like Paul Revere and others. Really, this begins, is the beginning of the Revolutionary War. In the town of Lexington, it was kind of on the road to Concord, there was some fighting that took place. Nobody really knows who took the first shot. The shot heard around the world. And what we see happening is some colonists died, some British died. And now we have an official battle that took place. Very small, but nonetheless a battle where people ended up dying. So this kind of changes the face of what's going to happen for the United States. Basically, the soldiers continued on to Concord, where what we call Minutemen, these guys that were there to defend Concord, they were there. They successfully pushed back the British soldiers, who retreated then back to Boston. And basically, on the entire route down to Boston, people were trying to take shots at them. So this really marks the beginning of the American Revolutionary War. So then what we see here is these are the things that are ultimately leading to American independence. Okay, so we see this all happening. Now, when we go back, you can kind of see where we end up. And there it is. All of those things leading ultimately to American independence. So there you have it, and we'll talk more about these later on. Thank you.